Welcome, family. Today is March 22nd, 2025, and I hope this video finds all of you well. I wanted to start out by discussing and talking about the picture of the circle rainbow. That circle rainbow happened to be in my backyard on my father's birthday, which was March 12th. It was such a beautiful reminder of his presence in mine and my family's life. And it continues to be there to this very day. And I've been very fortunate. That's not the only circle rainbow that shows up in my backyard. I've had a number of them show up. So I just wanted to share that with you. And that's why that picture is thumbnailed to this video this week. It's a beautiful reminder of my dad's in honor of him. And the topic this week, which so coincides with rainbows, is the Ark of God's Promises, trusting his rainbow in times of trials. In the midst of storms, whether literal or figurative, we often find ourselves in places of uncertainty, fear, and doubt. Life's challenges, much like a violent storm, can make us feel overwhelmed, lost, and exposed. However, as we look at Scripture, particularly the story of Noah and the ark, we are reminded of God's enduring promise and his faithfulness. There is profound significance of the Ark of God's Promise in how the rainbow serves as a powerful symbol of trusting in God during times of trial. Have you ever felt God asking you to do something that seemed overwhelming or didn't make sense? That happens to me quite often, as a matter of fact. And that's where discernment is very important and plays a part in all of this. If so, you're in good company. I'm going to share a story about I had gone to church one Sunday, and at that time, the pastor was going through chemotherapy. He happened to have cancer, and he was at the hospital quite often. And one day while in the waiting room, he was there, and there was a couple off to the side. And God says to him, I want you to go over there and tell this couple everything will be all right. Well, he hesitated, and he kind of questioned, why would he go over there and tell them? What if they thought he was crazy or something, Like, why would I go over there and say that to somebody? In the midst of his hesitation and questioning God's call to him to be obedient to what he was asking him to do, this couple had left by the time he decided he was going to go over there. So in the midst of our questioning, we allow the enemy to whisper those lies in our ears. When the call comes, it may very well be the answer that someone needed to hear at that time. The hope they prayed for would have come through you or I or whoever when God calls us to do these things. It is all about free will and choices we make when being called to obedience. And I'm going to tell you right now, that pastor never did that again. He said, when God calls me to say something or confirm or to let someone know or give them a word, I don't hesitate. I go right and I do it. Because you never know, those few words will make or break that person. And we need to heed the call. Just as Noah and the ark, it is not just a story of judgment, but of incredible hope. This passage reminds us of what it looks like to trust God in the middle of the unknown and embrace the big obedience for a big God. We serve a huge God, an endless Father. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, in Genesis 6:18. Noah's story is more than just a children's tale about animals and rainbows. It's about God's promise to protect and provide for those who follow him. While the flood represents God's dealing with the brokenness of humanity, The ark symbolizes salvation and hope. What stands out most isn't just the size of the instructions, it's Noah's response. Noah did everything just as God commanded him in Genesis 6:22. Think about that. God asked Noah to build something beyond anything he ever seen, something that likely didn't make sense at the time. Not only was the ark massive, but it had no rudder or sail. Noah wasn't just building a boat, he was building trust. God didn't ask Noah to navigate the journey. He asked him to be obedient and let him handle the direction. How often do we hesitate to obey God because we don't understand the entire plan, right? That happens all the time. I know it does for myself. Noah shows us that understanding isn't always required, but obedience is. His instructions also include bringing animals on board, 2 of every kind. This wasn't just about survival, it was about worship and continuing a relationship with God beyond the flood. Even in the middle of judgment, God was preparing for restoration. Noah's faithfulness wasn't just about his obedience, it extended to his family. They boarded the ark with him, protected by his willingness to follow God. And I remember off the top of my head, I can't remember the name of the movie, but it was in the early 2007s or something like that, where God had asked one of our brothers, he had asked this gentleman to build an ark in his backyard, and he kept being disobedient. He wasn't listening and heeding the call, and God was persistent on ensuring that he listened to what God was asking him to do, and eventually he did. He built this ark in his backyard, and he was shunned by his community, his neighborhood, his community, by everybody. They thought he was crazy. But sure enough, the flood came. It was Evan Almighty, I believe the movie was called. It was just such a profound movie, but it just so coincides with this whole story about God asking you to do something that is totally what we would consider off the wall. Like, why would I be doing this? But there are reasons, and God has those answers, and we just have to be obedient to the call. That kind of influence speaks to the power of living out our faith consistently. Our obedience can be a blessing, not just for us, but for those around us. Perhaps one of the profound words in this passage is the word but. God described the coming destruction, but I will establish my covenant with you, Genesis 6:18. That one word changes everything. While the world around Noah was facing judgment, God was making a promise of protection and purpose. In the face of overwhelming odds, God's but introduces hope. So what are the buts in our lives? There are so many, right? Maybe we feel unqualified, overwhelmed, or unsure, but God has a plan. God provides, but God is faithful. When God calls you to something big, remember Noah's story. Big obedience opens the door to God to work in ways beyond what we can only imagine, beyond our imagination. It might not make sense at the time. It might feel overwhelming. But when God establishes his promise, you can trust he will see it through. So, in times when we least expect God to work in our favor, he does. In all the times he calls us to do things, and we do them, and we heed the call, his hand is always there to protect us. I'll just give you an example. Do you ever just wonder how I escaped a car accident? There are so many times that God protects us over the dangers of things in our lives, such as a car accident. That isn't just a coincidence. That was the hand of the Lord protecting us. And I know He's done that to me many, many times. And I am so grateful for His intervention in our lives. The ark is a place of protection. That was just an example I wanted to share with all of you on how God works behind the scenes in all of our turmoil and trials and tribulations, but also when we least expect His hand to be there. It is always there. The ark is not just a boat, it was a refuge, a sanctuary, a place of safety. In the same way, God's promises provides us refuge in the midst of life's storms. The ark was a tangible sign of God's care for Noah and his family, just as God's promises are tangible reminders for us to trust Him during the storms of our lives. Just as the flood waters of Noah's time seemed overwhelming, many of us face storms, whether financial, broken relationships, or loss of loved ones. Those trials can cause us to question God's presence and His promises. I've done that a number of times. Why is that happening to me? It's not happening to you, it's happening for you. Always remember that. In those moments that we feel alone, as though the flood waters are rising higher and higher, threaten to overtake us, God is always there with us. And that so reminds me of that picture called The Footsteps, where Jesus is holding us and walking, and He's carrying us through. And He always does. It's such a beautiful depiction of how that works. So in conclusion, we face storms in our lives. Let us remember the Ark of God's Promise and the rainbow that follows the storm. God's faithfulness is certain, and His promises are true. Trusting in His provision, His presence, and His restoration will help us navigate the trials we face, knowing that His covenant with us is unbreakable and eternal. As we walk through the storms, let the rainbow of God's promises be a beacon of hope, reminding us that after the rain, there's always the light of His love and grace. And those rainbows are always there for us. And His promises are always true. He is always with us. He will never leave us nor forsake us. And with this, I'm going to conclude by sending much love to all of you. And I hope you have a beautiful, blessed, overflowing, abundant week and weeks to follow. And until next week, bye for now.